So let's look at one of the most important concepts that we have in programming languages, this notion of variables. Now, variables are what we use to actually store bits of data, and you can visualize them as if they were, if you know spreadsheets, as if they're cells in a spreadsheet. And they can hold a value that we use when the program's running. We can manipulate those values. It's the most important concept in programming in many ways, because it's how we store and manipulate data that our programs will use. Now, what's slightly different to cells in a spreadsheet is that each value, each cell, we create and we give a unique name to those cells, a distinct name. And those names are names that we simply make up, and we try to make them sensible names. So here are some names, for example, bill, total, salary, month, total income, percentage increase. Now notice how PHP requires us to put a $sign in front of them. Now there's the facility to have sort of more complex names, things like total income and percentage increase. But what we're not allowed to do is to put a space in the middle of the name. So you'll see here how we're using an underscore character. So identifiers, names in PHP, the names for our variables, must begin with an ASCII letter, and it can be uppercase or lowercase. You are allowed to use that underscore character inside the name if you want, and you can use certain characters within the name, certain special characters. You are also allowed to use digits, but it mustn't begin with a digit, but the digit can be in the middle or at the end of the name that you choose. So let's have a look at some examples. So here you can see I've got $bill, $value count, another value 3. Here, another value 3 is an example of one where we put a number on the end. You are allowed to use capital letters. Traditionally, though, you're probably better off just making them all lowercase unless you really know what you're doing, because uppercase is used for something else as well, so it can be a problem. I'll talk about that in a minute. Certain special variables in PHP begin with an underscore, and you can see here's one. Now we can create those ourselves, but it tends to be something that it's best to avoid. Invalid ones would be things like not valid, and the reason that that's not valid is because it has a space in the middle of it. So when PHP comes to try and interpret what that actually means, it'll get confused. It'll go, well, $not is a variable, and then it'll think the word valid is something else, and so it'll generate an error message. You're also not allowed to use punctuation at the start of a character, or in many of these anyway. So, for example, a square bracket isn't allowed, and also you're not allowed to begin it with a number. So you can see the valid ones and the invalid ones there. What is important is that you're consistent. So, for example, if you call something total bill, you can't at a later point suddenly start thinking, well, that's going to be called total bill 1. Or more commonly, you make a mistake, you call it total bill with a capital B in the middle of it, and then later on in the program, you call it total bill with a lowercase b. PHP will think those are two different variables. So the important point here is to try and be consistent. Now there is something called camel case, and we'll use it occasionally. Camel case is where the first word is in lowercase, but subsequent words in the variable name all begin with a capital letter. So if you have a look at total bill, you can see that the B in bill is a capital letter, but then the other letters like D, O, T, M in first day of the month, those are all in capital letters. So how does it actually work then? Well, let's have a look at variables and how they actually work. So when you create a name in PHP, what happens is a space is reserved and labelled for that item. So PHP looks for you to actually start using variables, and the moment that you use a variable, it creates a box. It creates that space for you to actually store a value in, and it labels it with that name. So whenever, in this example, for example, we talk about $bill inside our program, PHP will know that we're talking about a particular box, a particular space in memory. Again, you can think of it as if it was a cell in a spreadsheet. So to give it a value, what we do is we simply use the equal sign and then we supply the value. So in this example here, you can see we've got a box called $bill and we're going to give it the value 42, and all that PHP does is it writes that value 42 into the box, just like that. Now this is an example with a whole number, but of course it could be a floating point number, it could be a real number, something like 57.98. It could be a string, so we could say no payment. And here the string no payment is written into the box. Now, as you've seen from these examples, PHP provides lots and lots of different data types: whole numbers, floating point numbers, strings, and are those special ones that are called booleans, but we'll talk about those later on. Also, there are arrays and objects. The key distinguishing feature between these is that integers, floating points, strings, and booleans, those are single values. So when we create a box, it's just going to be a box which holds a single value. You do also get these special sort of data structures, these special things which enable you to store multiple values. And those are arrays and objects, but we'll talk about those much later on. Often they talk about single value data types as being scalar, and those ones which can store multiple values as being compound. But again, don't worry about that at the moment. We'll come on to that later on in the course. So here are some variables. For example, obviously, bill equals 42, we're storing an integer, a whole number. Bill equals 57.98, we're storing a floating point number. And bill equals no payment, well, that's storing a string of characters. And remember, when it's a string, we have to wrap up the start of the character, start of the string with quotes, and the end of the string with quotes, so it looks like that. Now, as the program continues, what we might do is we might change the value of the variable. So let's have a look at how that actually works in practice. So here I've got a variable called bill, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign it the value 42. So we've got our box, and inside the box we write the value 42, and that value is knocking around. We can print it, we can do whatever we like to it. If at a later point in the program we go bill equals 58, what happens is the value of 42 is completely overwritten with the new value. So you can see the 42 is replaced with the 58. Sometimes what we do is we use the old value to recalculate the new value. So in this example, let's give the box the value 42. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that value in a calculation to calculate the new value. So let's have a look at the next line. You can see it says bill equals bill times 52. Now, what that will do is that will find the value in the box, which is 42, multiply it by 2, and what that does is that gives us 84, and then it overwrites the value in the box. So we end up with 84 in the box. Now that notation can be a little bit complicated, but we do use it quite a lot, so I'll just mention it again. Bill equals bill times 2. Now you might find it easier to think of it like this. Visualize covering the left-hand side. So if you like, visualize just the bit on the right which says bill times 2. And what's going to happen is bill, that cell, that variable contains the value 42. We're going to multiply it by 2 to give us 84. And then that value overwrites the existing value of bill. So the 42 is overwritten with the 84. Now, some languages, some programming languages are very strict about what kind of information you store in a cell. So if you say that a cell or a variable will contain a whole number, you're only ever allowed to store whole numbers in that box. PHP isn't like that. PHP isn't strict at all. So what you can do is you can put an integer in a box, and then what you could do is you could simply overwrite the integer and you could put something else in there, like for example a string. Now that means that it's very easy, very straightforward to do whatever you like in PHP, but of course the problem with it is that it's possible you might make a mistake and PHP won't pick up on that. So instead of it actually coming back with an error message saying something like, are you really sure that you wanted to change that number into a string? PHP will just do it. It won't give you any kind of alerts or messages. It will assume that that's what you wanted to do. The downside of that, for example, is, you might mistype, you might make a mistake, and PHP will just carry on anyway. So you can imagine, for example, instead of typing Bill, you typed bull. PHP will go, oh, well, that's what you wanted to do. You actually wanted to use a variable called bull. And as I've indicated previously, the names that we choose are case sensitive. So if you use lowercase value or uppercase value or a mixture of letters, PHP will think that those are 3 different variables, 3 different cells. Remember to put the $sign in front of them for the names that we make up. This is an easy way to start making mistakes in your program. So the key is to be consistent. And what I normally do is I try to make all my variables lowercase all the time, apart from when I'm using that camel cap stuff. So here, for example, you can see I've got 3 variables called value, and I assign them 3 different values, 56, 78, and 89. And then we can print those values out. And you can see what will happen is if that runs, it will actually print out 56, 78, 89, because we've got 3 different boxes, 3 different variables. Now, a particular kind of value that we sometimes use in our programs is something that's called a constant. And a constant is, as the name suggests, something that will take the same value for the entire length of the program. And there's a special way of creating constants in PHP. We use the define command. So we supply the name of the constant first, and then we supply the value that that constant will have second. Now, the tradition indicates that constants have an uppercase value, and you'll notice that this is one of these ones where we don't use a $sign in front of it. Now, one of the things that I did talk about last week was using a dot to do concatenation. So I've just popped that in these slides here. And what concatenation does for us is it combines strings together. If we supply a variable, what it will do is it will attach the value of that variable onto the string. So here I'm creating a variable called output string, and it's going to take the value. Well, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to have a string. So you can see it says he then said, then there's a space, and then on the end of the string what it's going to do is it's going to attach the value of quote. If quote was a string, then it's very straightforward, because what we're doing is we're simply adding a string to a string. When I say adding, what I mean there is it's just combining them together. If quote contained a number, then what it will do is it will simply convert that number to a string and then attach it to the other string. So again, we'll end up with a string, but it will say something like he then said 42, or whatever it was that was inside that quote variable. Here's a little thing then. You can see all the different data types with values. So you can see some whole numbers, some floating point numbers, and we're simply printing them out.